In the passage of Scripture preceding the one that we read just a little bit earlier in the service this morning, Jesus and his disciples were sailing across the Sea of Galilee, and suddenly a gale blew up and the waves were just crashing over the sides of the boat, and it was such a violent storm that the disciples feared that they were all going to perish. Many of these men had spent their entire adult lives fishing and sailing on these waters. They had been through storms before, but nothing like this. It was as if death was reaching out its bony hand to tap them on the shoulder and tell them that their time was up. Meanwhile, Jesus was in the back of the boat. He was asleep on a cushion, and the disciples awakened him. "Lord, wake up! Don't you care that we are about to drown?" And Jesus stood and commanded the storm to be still. And suddenly, it was still. The wind stopped, the waves settled. It became glassy and quiet. And the disciples were totally amazed. I mean, as frightened as they had been by the power of this terrible storm, here in their presence was someone with even more power. I mean, who was this guy they thought they knew? And then the story immediately following was our passage of the morning, where Jesus calms a different kind of storm, a storm of the mind. They landed the boat on the opposite side of the lake from the Jewish region of Galilee, and they landed in the Gentile land of the Gerasenes, and Jesus was immediately confronted by a man who had a severe problem. Imagine for a moment, just shut your eyes and imagine the mangled chains, the shattered shackles, this poor man, naked and covered with self-inflicted wounds, prowling around the tombs, screaming at forces no one else could see or hear. He was out there living with the dead, unnamed, ostracized, alone, at home, nowhere, not even in his own mind or body. He was described as being demon-possessed. Of course, in that age, the diagnosis of demon possession was used to describe all sorts of physical and mental problems. And while we don't have a nice, clear, satisfying modern diagnosis, it's obvious that the man had some very real problems. He was not a part of the community. He was not a part of a family, living alone out in the cemetery where he ran naked among the tombs. And in verse 29, we read of how when people had tried to capture him and had even used chains to try to control him, but with this violent, maniacal fury, he would break the chains and escape. Now, in some ancient cultures, families would bring food offerings out to the cemeteries to appease the souls of the departed. But knowing this crazy guy was living among the tombs, they would have had to think twice before going near the place. You know, can you imagine? Half-starved, more dead than alive, wild and dirty, living off the gifts, the offerings to the dead, howling, shrieking, lurking among the graves. A frightening scenario. You know, down through the ages, people have attempted all kinds of cures. French archaeologists have unearthed skulls from the Neolithic age that have had holes carefully cut in them, perhaps to release spirits or demons. Similar skulls have been found in Egypt and among the Inca sites in Peru. It's interesting how often the patient would survive at least long enough for the bones of their head to begin healing. And if that wasn't bad enough, I mean, going through that sort of an ordeal without anesthesia, imagine people thinking they're helping you by torturing you. Down through the ages, torture has been used to try to free someone who they consider possessed by a demon. One treatment was to have them burned at the stake. It was believed that eventually it would get so uncomfortable that the demon or the evil spirit would leave the body. Now, true, the human host would likely be killed by the remedy, but since the evil spirit had supposedly been driven out, it was believed that you were saving their eternal soul, and you were doing them a great favor by killing them. Well, the demoniac was a man with severe problems. And when he saw Jesus, it was obvious he didn't want Jesus' help. "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." And perhaps he feared Jesus would likewise bind him in chains and torture him in an effort to drive the demons away. Jesus asked him his name, and he replied, "Legion." A legion, of course, was a unit in the Roman army containing usually around 5,000 soldiers. In other words, he believed he was being oppressed by thousands of evil spirits. Now, in Mark's gospel, it mentions of Mary of Magdalene, who was freed of 7 demons. Well, this man claimed to have thousands. And the demons begged Jesus to be sent into a herd of swine rather than being condemned to the abyss. There was a Jewish belief at that time that there was this location called the abyss. It was a large underground cavern, which was the designated place of punishment and imprisonment for the demons. Surprisingly, Jesus agreed to the request, and the commentator William Barclay suggests that once permission was granted, the man himself might have charged out towards the swine, shrieking and waving his arms and crying and acting out his exorcism. The herd of swine, reasonably enough, panicked and charged down the steep slope and drowned in the depths of the lake. But you know, the danger of looking at just this particular passage, you might say, putting it under a microscope, is that we can easily miss the larger point that Luke is making again and again in chapter 8. In verse 22, as I mentioned, experienced sailors were panicked by a violent, terrible storm on the lake. The boat was filling with water. They had exhausted their strength. There was nothing more they could do. They cried out to Jesus, who stepped in with the power to save. And he revealed a power that extended even over nature. In verse 26, as the snow slides off the roof, In verse 26, they arrive in the region of the Gerasenes, and Jesus healed this man who was totally undone, overcome, unable to help himself. And Jesus demonstrated that he had authority over the demonic. He had, once again, the power to help. Verse 40 of chapter 8, Jairus, the man in charge of the local synagogue, has a daughter who has died. She's beyond healing. She's beyond human help. But Jesus called her back to life. Wow. Demonstrating that he has the power even over death. Verse 45, Jesus is touched by a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years and whose condition has baffled all of the medical authorities of the day. In faith, she reached out and touched the tassel of his garment and felt the healing power fill her body. Again and again in this chapter, Jesus demonstrated his power to help and the power to heal in situations where people felt helpless and where the problem is beyond all human help. But this story of the demoniac has a surprising ending. Verse 34, verse 35, the pig tenders race into town to tell everyone what happened. People want to see this for themselves, so they came and they found this man who had previously been such a terror, and now he is just sitting quietly at the feet of Jesus. He's clothed, he's in his right mind. Rather than hanging out with dead people, he's sitting at the feet of the Lord of life. He's clothed, he's no longer living like an animal, he's governed by a sense of what is decent and proper. Luke tells us he is in his right mind. No longer was he living in the fear that someone was going to try to chain him and torture him. Now he saw the world clearly. He understood life as it actually was. A powerful healing of the mind had taken place. And seeing this great miracle, the people rejoiced and danced and sang. No. They were afraid. They were very afraid. They asked Jesus to please leave their country. You know, our natural human reaction is to feel afraid when we are in the presence of something we don't understand, something more powerful than ourselves. I mean, that's the basic idea behind so many science fiction books and movies of the last century. Something unknown and mysterious and powerful suddenly appears, whether it's the creature from the Black Lagoon or the Blob or an alien. And these movies are successful because they connect with our natural fear of powerful things we don't understand and can't control. And so the people of this area were even more afraid of Jesus than they had been of the demon-possessed man. And they asked him to please leave. Faced with their fear, Jesus agreed. And of course, the man who had been healed wanted to go along with them, but Jesus refused. Jesus told him it was up to him to do what Jesus could not do. These are your people. These are your family and your neighbors. They are afraid of me. So you must go in my place. These people knew what you were like before you were healed. Now they will see for themselves what God has done for you. This unnamed man would be the first missionary to the Gentiles. He would be a living billboard of God's love and God's grace. The people of Gerasene feared God's power. And as they looked out at the drowned pigs, Perhaps they calculated that the price of this man being made whole was simply more than they wanted to pay. The herdsmen who had been watching the pigs they're out of a job. The farmers who owned them discovered their stock had been liquidated. What do? The community as a whole was frightened by Jesus' power. The price was too high. The price of being made whole is still high. Are we afraid of what God's healing and new direction in our lives might cost us? You see, a lot of people want to be healed a little bit. They want enough to feel better, but not so much that it requires a lot of change in their life. You know, a study was made of people who have had heart bypass surgery, people who have been told by their doctors that they have to change their eating habits, they have to lose weight, they have to stop smoking, they have to start exercising. In short, they have to significantly change the way they are living their lives. And the patients knew and understood that they should make these changes. They knew that they would die sooner rather than later if they didn't. And yet, multiple studies have shown that after 2 years, 90% of the patients did not significantly alter their behavior. Of course, some tried really hard for a few weeks or for a few months. They tried to eat differently and to exercise and to give up all their bad habits. Some never even got that far. But after just 2 years, most of them had failed. And when it comes to our religion, most people simply want painkillers that will help them to feel better, not the real and costly heart surgery that will bring change and which will make them whole and well again. How common it is for people to come to church and have their face just shine with a spiritual radiance. Then they go home. They go home and they're crabby and short-tempered with their own family. I've done it myself. Christianity is not a cosmetic we apply to look better. Sometimes it can really be nasty-tasting medicine that we have to drink straight every day. God can help us, but only as we really want that help. Only as we are willing to surrender our pride and our ego and ask for God's direction and have the determination and grit to follow in the direction God gives us. It's far more than just a one-time emotional experience. It's a daily decision of discipline and surrender. It's allowing our concern to grow beyond just ourselves and reach out to others. Are we afraid of changes that God might want to bring to our lives? I'd like you to take just 1 minute and consider, is there anything in your life that you would like to have changed? Is there anything in your life you would like to have God's help and power correcting? And what might that cost? Please take just 45 seconds to consider and ponder this very personal matter.